Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mists of time, back through the centuries, back through the millennia to a world that existed long before our modern conveniences, long before our comfortable lives, to a time when survival itself was an act of courage, when every single day demanded strength you and I can barely imagine. Tonight, we're going to explore the lives of the ancient Maya, and I want you to settle in, get comfortable, let your breathing slow down, because what we're about to discover together is going to take us on a journey that spans over 3,000 years of human endurance, ingenuity, and yes, sometimes brutal reality. Before we begin this journey together, if you're enjoying this calm exploration of history, go ahead and gently tap that subscribe button for dreamless timelines and leave a like to help others find this peaceful journey through the past. Now, let your mind relax as we step back in time. Imagine waking up before dawn in the year 800 CE, in the heart of the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. The air is thick, humid, pressing against your skin like a warm blanket. The jungle around you is alive with sounds, the howler monkeys beginning their morning chorus, their calls echoing through the dense canopy like some ancient alarm clock that you can't turn off. You're not in a bed as you know it. You're lying on a woven mat on a dirt floor inside a small house made of wooden poles and thatch. And as you open your eyes, the first thing you notice is that your back aches, your muscles are sore from yesterday's labor, and you know with absolute certainty that today will be no different. This is life for most of the ancient Maya, and it's about to test you in ways you never imagined. Let's start with something basic, something we take for granted every single day: food. Now, when I say the ancient Maya had it rough with food, I don't mean they didn't have enough variety on their plate or that they were bored with their menu. I mean that getting enough food to survive was a constant, grinding challenge that consumed most of their waking hours. The foundation of Maya life, the thing that everything else rested on, was corn, or as they called it, maize. But this wasn't just some crop they grew. Maize was sacred to the Maya. They believed that the gods had created humans from maize dough, that human flesh was literally made from corn. The Popol Vuh, their sacred text, tells the story of how the gods tried and failed several times to create humans, first from mud, then from wood, and finally, successfully, from maize. So when a Maya person looked at corn, they weren't just seeing food. They were seeing their own divine origin, their connection to the cosmos, their very reason for existing. But here's the thing about corn in the ancient Maya world. It wasn't easy to grow, not by a long shot. If you think farming today is hard work, and it definitely is, imagine doing it without tractors, without metal tools for most of their history, without chemical fertilizers, without irrigation systems in many areas, without even the wheel. Yeah, you heard that right. The Maya never used the wheel for practical purposes, even though they understood the concept and used it in toys. So everything, and I mean everything, was done by human muscle power. You want to clear a field? You're doing it with stone axes and fire. You want to plant your crops? You're doing it with a digging stick, basically a pointed wooden pole, getting down on your knees in the dirt under the blazing tropical sun, making holes one by one, dropping in seeds, covering them up, moving to the next spot, hour after hour, day after day during the planting season. The agricultural system most Maya farmers used was called slash and burn, or swidden agriculture if you want to get technical about it. Here's how it worked, and trust me, it was as brutal as it sounds. First, you'd select a patch of jungle that you wanted to turn into a field. Then, during the dry season, usually around March or April, you and your family and maybe your neighbors would go out there with your stone axes and you'd start cutting down trees. Not with chainsaws, not with metal axes, but with axes made of stone. If you've never tried to chop down a tree with a stone axe, let me tell you, it makes chopping with a steel axe look like a walk in the park. The stone blades would dull quickly, they'd chip, sometimes they'd break, and you'd have to constantly sharpen them or make new ones. And you weren't just cutting down one tree, you were clearing an entire field, sometimes several acres, tree by tree, brush by brush, vine by vine, in heat that could easily reach 90 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity at probably 80 or 90%. Once you'd cut down all the vegetation, you'd let it dry out for a few weeks and then you'd set it on fire. Now, this wasn't just lighting a little campfire. This was a massive controlled burn of everything you just spent weeks cutting down. The fire would roar through the dried vegetation, the heat would be intense, the smoke would fill the air for miles around, and when it was done, you'd have a field covered in ash. That ash was actually important because it would fertilize the soil, adding nutrients that the crops would need. But here's the problem. Those nutrients would only last for a few years. After you'd planted and harvested the same field for maybe 2 or 3 years, the soil would be exhausted. It would be depleted of nutrients and your crop yields would start to drop. So you'd have to abandon that field, let it go back to jungle, which would take 15 or 20 years, and meanwhile, you'd have to clear a new field and start the whole brutal process over again. Think about what this means. It means that Maya farmers were constantly clearing new land, constantly doing this back-breaking work of cutting and burning and planting. It means that at any given time, a Maya farming family needed access to way more land than they were actually farming, because they needed to have fields in various stages of regrowth. And in areas where population got dense, which happened in many Maya cities during what we call the Classic period, from about 250 to 900 CE, this became a real problem. There just wasn't enough land to go around. People had to farm the same fields more often before they'd fully recovered, which meant the yields got lower and lower, which meant people were getting less and less food from the same amount of work. But wait, it gets better. Well, actually, it gets worse. The Maya didn't just grow their food, they had to process it. And the processing of corn was a job that fell primarily to women, and it was incredibly labor-intensive. Every single day, Maya women would wake up before dawn, and I mean really early, like 3 or 4 in the morning, and they would start processing corn for the day's meals. First, they had to soak the dried corn kernels in water mixed with lime, and I don't mean the fruit, I mean limestone that had been burned and ground into powder. This process was called nixtamalization, and it was crucial because it made the nutrients in the corn more available for human digestion, and it prevented diseases like pellagra. They'd soak the corn overnight, and then in the morning, they'd rinse it, and then they'd have to grind it. And when I say grind it, I mean they'd kneel down in front of a large flat stone called a metate, and they'd use a smaller stone called a mano, kind of like a rolling pin made of stone, and they'd push the corn back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, grinding it into flour. This wasn't a quick process. It could take 2 or 3 hours every single morning just to grind enough corn to feed a family for one day. And remember, you're doing this while kneeling, your knees pressing into a stone floor or the dirt, your back bent over, your arms and shoulders pushing this heavy stone over and over and over. Archaeologists who've studied Maya skeletons have found that Maya women had distinctive wear patterns on their bones, particularly their knees, backs, and arms, from spending hours every day in this grinding position. Some women developed arthritis early in life. Some had permanent knee damage. This was just the price of eating. After the corn was ground into dough, then it could be made into tortillas, which had to be hand-potted and shaped and cooked on a clay griddle over a fire, or it could be made into tamales or other dishes. But the grinding, that daily grinding, that was non-negotiable. Every day before the sun came up, Maya women were on their knees grinding corn. And if you're thinking, well, at least the men had it easier, think again. While the women were grinding corn, the men were out in the fields, in the heat, doing the brutal work of farming, or they were off doing labor service for the nobles, building temples and palaces and pyramids, hauling massive stones without wheeled carts or draft animals. Oh yeah, that's another thing. The Maya didn't have horses, oxen, cattle, or any other large domesticated animals that could help with heavy work. They had dogs and turkeys, and that was about it. No animals to pull plows, no animals to haul heavy loads, no animals to ride. Everything that needed to be moved, from stones weighing several tons to baskets of corn to building materials, everything was carried by human beings. The Maya were incredibly skilled engineers and architects. They built massive pyramids that still stand today, towering structures that required moving and precisely placing millions of stone blocks. And they did it all with human muscle power. When the nobles wanted to build a new temple, they'd require the common people to provide labor service, and these people would have to report to the construction site, and they'd spend days or weeks or months cutting stone in quarries, shaping it with stone tools, and then physically carrying these stones, some of them weighing hundreds of pounds, to the construction site, and then hauling them up ramps to the tops of pyramids. Let's talk about those pyramids for a second, because they're super impressive when you look at them. But when you think about what it took to build them, they become testaments to human suffering. Take the Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. It's about 79 feet tall, and it has a square base with each side measuring about 180 feet. It's made of stone, covered with limestone, and it's been standing there for over 1,000 years. Beautiful structure. Now think about building it without metal tools, without wheels, without pulleys for most of the construction, without any of the equipment we'd consider basic for construction. Every stone had to be quarried, shaped, moved, and placed by hand. And this wasn't some small crew of professional builders. This was thousands of common people, farmers mostly, who were required to leave their fields during certain times of year and come work on these royal construction projects. Imagine you're one of these workers. You've just spent months clearing and planting your field, and now the lord of your city has decreed that you need to report for labor service. So you leave your family, you walk for maybe several days to get to the city center if you live in a rural area, and then you're assigned to a work crew. Maybe you're cutting stone in a quarry, swinging a stone hammer for hours, breathing in stone dust, the sun beating down on you. Maybe you're part of a team hauling stones, and you and 20 other guys are pulling ropes attached to a massive block, dragging it over log rollers, inch by inch, taking the whole day to move it a few hundred feet. You're fed, usually, just corn gruel or tortillas, basic stuff to keep you working. You sleep in temporary shelters, you don't see your family for weeks. And if you get injured, if you drop a stone on your foot, or if you fall from a height, or if you just work yourself to exhaustion, well, there's no hospital, no modern medicine. You either recover or you don't. Speaking of medicine, let's talk about health in the ancient Maya world, because this is where things get really brutal. If you're finding this journey through Maya history fascinating and it's helping you drift off to sleep, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment about what historical civilization you'd like us to explore next here on Dreamless Timelines. Your support keeps these deep dives into history coming. Now let's continue into the harsh realities of Maya health and medicine. Disease was a constant companion for the ancient Maya, and I'm not just talking about the occasional cold or flu, though they definitely had those. I'm talking about a whole range of diseases and parasites and infections that made life miserable and often short. Let's start with parasites, because the Maya world was basically a parasite paradise. In the tropical environment where they lived, with poor sanitation, no sewage systems in most areas, water sources that could easily become contaminated, parasites were everywhere. Intestinal worms were incredibly common. We're talking about roundworms, hookworms, tapeworms, all kinds of worms taking up residence in people's guts. These parasites would cause chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, malnutrition because they were stealing nutrients from their host, and in severe cases, especially in children, they could cause serious illness or death. And it wasn't just intestinal parasites. There were parasites that got into your blood, parasites that affected your liver, parasites that caused all sorts of problems. Chagas disease, caused by a parasite transmitted by kissing bugs, was likely present and caused heart problems and digestive issues. Leishmaniasis, another parasitic disease, caused by the bite of sandflies, would create terrible skin sores that could disfigure people. And then there was malaria. Oh man, malaria. This disease, transmitted by mosquitoes, was probably widespread in the lowland Maya areas. Malaria causes fever, chills, sweating, headaches, nausea, and it comes in waves. You'd feel okay for a while, then boom, another attack of fever and chills. It could kill you, especially if you were a child, or if you were already weakened by malnutrition or other diseases. And there was no quinine, no modern anti-malarial drugs. If you got malaria, you just had to suffer through it and hope your body could fight it off. The Maya did have medicine, don't get me wrong. They had a sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine. They used hundreds of different plants for medical purposes. They knew which plants could reduce fever, which could help with pain, which could treat wounds, which could help with digestive problems. Maya healers, often called shamans or medicine men, had extensive knowledge passed down through generations. They could set broken bones, they could treat wounds, they could help with childbirth. But there were limits to what they could do. They had no antibiotics, so bacterial infections could easily become deadly. They had no way to perform complex surgeries. They had no blood transfusions. They didn't understand germ theory, so they didn't know that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms. This meant that what we'd consider minor injuries or illnesses today could be death sentences. A simple cut that got infected could lead to blood poisoning and death. A tooth abscess could spread infection to your jaw and your brain and kill you. Appendicitis was a death sentence. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both the mother and baby. Maternal mortality was high. Infant mortality was even higher. It's estimated that maybe 30 to 40% of Maya children died before reaching the age of 5. Think about that. Almost half of all babies born wouldn't live to see their 5th birthday. They die from diseases, from malnutrition, from accidents, from infections. And even if you survived childhood, your life expectancy wasn't great. The average life expectancy for an ancient Maya person who made it to adulthood was probably somewhere in the 30s or early 40s. Sure, some people lived longer. There were definitely Maya people who lived into their 60s or even older, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most people could expect a relatively short life, and a good chunk of it would be spent dealing with pain and illness and disability. Let's talk about dental health, because this was brutal too. The Maya diet was heavy on corn, and corn is full of carbohydrates that bacteria in your mouth love to feed on. Plus, the Maya often added honey to their food, and honey is basically pure sugar. So cavities were super common. And remember, there are no dentists, no fillings, no root canals. If you got a cavity and it got bad enough, you were just living with the pain until maybe the tooth fell out, or maybe a healer extracted it, probably without any anesthesia beyond maybe chewing some plant that had mild pain-killing properties. Tooth abscesses were common and incredibly painful. Your face would swell up, you'd have this constant throbbing pain, and you just have to deal with it. Interestingly, the Maya also deliberately filed and decorated their teeth, especially among the nobility. They'd file their teeth into points or different shapes, and they'd inlay them with jade or pyrite or obsidian. This was a status symbol, a way of showing wealth and rank. But imagine having someone file your teeth down with stone tools and then drill holes in them to insert gemstones. It would have been incredibly painful, and it would have made the teeth more vulnerable to decay and infection. But hey, fashion is pain, right? Even in ancient Mesoamerica. The Maya also practiced cranial modification, deliberately shaping babies' heads by binding them between boards. Starting shortly after birth, they'd strap a baby's head between 2 pieces of wood, one pressing on the forehead and one on the back of the skull, and they'd leave this on for days or weeks or even months. This would flatten the forehead and elongate the skull, creating a distinctive shape that the Maya considered beautiful and noble. It was a sign of high status. But think about what this meant for the baby. Constant pressure on their developing skull, probably headaches and discomfort, and possibly some developmental issues. But it was just what was done, especially among the elite families who could afford to have their children not working and could devote the time to this process. Now let's talk about violence, because the ancient Maya world was not a peaceful place, despite what some early scholars wanted to believe. For a long time, there was this romantic image of the Maya as peaceful astronomers and mathematicians, basically the ancient world's philosophers, spending their time studying the stars and contemplating the universe. And sure, they did do a lot of that. The Maya were brilliant astronomers and mathematicians, but they were also fierce warriors who engaged in regular warfare, human sacrifice, and political violence that was absolutely brutal. Maya cities were constantly at war with each other. This wasn't like modern nation-states fighting occasional wars. This was ongoing, endemic warfare. City-states would compete for control of trade routes, for tribute payments from smaller settlements, for captives, for prestige. Kings would lead their warriors on raids against neighboring cities. They'd try to capture enemy nobles, especially enemy kings, because capturing a high-status prisoner was a huge prestige boost. And what happened to those prisoners? Well, often they were sacrificed. We'll get to that in a bit, but first, let's talk about what warfare was like for the average Maya warrior. If you were a commoner and your city went to war, you'd be expected to serve as a warrior. The Maya didn't have professional standing armies for most of their history. When war came, farmers would set down their digging sticks and pick up their weapons. And Maya weapons were effective, but also kind of terrifying. The main weapon was the obsidian-bladed club or sword. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and when it's properly flaked, it can be sharper than a steel scalpel. But it's also brittle. An obsidian blade could slice through flesh easily, creating terrible wounds, but it could also shatter on impact with another weapon or bone. Warriors also used spears with obsidian points, atlatls, which were spear throwers that could launch darts with significant force, bows and arrows in later periods, and slings for throwing stones. Maya warriors didn't have metal armor. They'd wear potted cotton armor, basically thick cotton quilted into multiple layers. This could actually provide decent protection against obsidian blades and arrows, but it was heavy and hot, and this is the tropics, remember, so you're fighting in blazing heat wearing thick cotton padding. Warriors would also carry shields, often decorated with elaborate designs showing their rank and city affiliation. And they'd go into battle with elaborate costumes, feather headdresses, jade jewelry, face paint, the whole 9 yards. Warfare was as much about spectacle and terror as it was about actual combat.
A typical Maya battle wasn't like the massive field battles you might imagine from European history. It was more like a series of ambushes, raids, and small-scale engagements. A group of warriors would maybe hide in the jungle waiting to ambush an enemy patrol or trading party, or they'd attack an outlying settlement trying to capture people and loot valuables. Sometimes there would be larger battles, especially when one city was trying to conquer another. But even these weren't massive affairs by ancient standards. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill as many enemies as possible. The goal was often to capture high-value prisoners while killing or routing the common soldiers. And if you were captured, your fate depended on who you were. If you were a noble or a high-status warrior, you might be kept alive for a while, paraded as a trophy, and then eventually sacrificed in an elaborate ceremony. If you were a commoner, you might be enslaved, forced to work for your captors for the rest of your life. Or you might be sacrificed right away. Or you might be killed on the spot. It really depended on the specific circumstances and the needs of your captors. Let's talk about sacrifice now, because this is one of the most brutal aspects of Maya culture, and it's something that modern people often struggle to understand. The Maya practiced human sacrifice, and they did it regularly. It was a central part of their religion. They believed that the gods required blood, human blood, to keep the world functioning. The sun needed blood to rise each morning. The rain god needed blood to send rain. The earth needed blood to be fertile. And the way the Maya saw it, giving blood to the gods was a sacred duty, the most important thing a person could do. It was an honor to be sacrificed. It was the ultimate offering. But from our modern perspective, looking at what actually happened, it was horrifying. There were several different methods of sacrifice that the Maya used. One common method was decapitation. The victim would be held down, and a priest or executioner would use a sharp obsidian blade to cut off their head. Quick, relatively, if done skillfully, but absolutely brutal to witness. Another method was heart extraction. The victim would be held down on an altar, usually bent backward over a stone, and a priest would use an obsidian knife to cut through the ribs and pull out the still beating heart. This was the death that was reserved for the most important captives, especially captured enemy rulers. It was supposed to be the most honorable way to die, the most pleasing to the gods. Sometimes victims were shot with arrows.
They'd be tied to a frame or a stake, and warriors would shoot them with arrows, not necessarily aiming to kill quickly, but to make them bleed. Other times, victims would be thrown into sacred cenotes, which are deep, natural sinkholes filled with water. The Yucatan Peninsula is dotted with these cenotes, and the Maya considered them entrances to the underworld, connections to the rain god. They'd throw in precious objects, jade, gold, pottery, and they'd also throw in human beings, often children. The victims would drown unless they were already dead before being thrown in, which sometimes they were. Children were specifically selected for certain sacrifices, particularly sacrifices to the rain god. The Maya believed that the tears of children would please the rain god and bring rain, so during times of drought, which were common and devastating, children would be sacrificed. Sometimes they were orphans or children of very poor families whose parents had sold them or given them up. Sometimes they were children of nobles who were offering their own children as the ultimate sacrifice. These children would be dressed in blue, the color associated with the rain god, decorated with jewelry, and then sacrificed. The archaeological evidence for this is clear and heartbreaking. At the bottom of the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, archaeologists have found the remains of dozens of children, some as young as 3 or 4 years old. Now, it's important to understand that the Maya didn't see this as murder. They saw it as a sacred act, a necessary thing to keep the cosmos functioning. But that doesn't make it any less brutal from our perspective. And it wasn't just captives and slaves that were sacrificed. The Maya elite, kings, and nobles also practiced bloodletting as a form of offering to the gods. They would pierce their tongues, their earlobes, their genitals with stingray spines or obsidian blades, and they'd let the blood drip onto paper, which would then be burned, the smoke carrying the blood up to the gods. This was seen as a kingly duty, something that demonstrated the ruler's piety and his willingness to suffer for his people. But imagine doing this regularly, deliberately causing yourself intense pain by piercing the most sensitive parts of your body. It must have been absolutely agonizing. The ball game was another aspect of Maya culture that could end in sacrifice. The Maya played a ball game that was part sport, part ritual. Teams would compete to get a heavy rubber ball through a stone hoop mounted high on the wall of a ball court, but they couldn't use their hands. They could only use their hips, elbows, and knees to hit the ball. The ball was solid rubber and heavy, and getting hit with it hurt. Players wore protective padding, but they still got bruised and battered. And the stakes of the game were sometimes literally life and death. In some versions of the game, at least according to Maya art and inscriptions, the losing team or the losing captain would be sacrificed. Imagine playing a sport where if you lose, you get your heart cut out. That adds a whole new level of pressure.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about social structure, because understanding how Maya society was organized helps explain why life was so brutal for most people. Maya society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top was the king, called the Kuhul Ashau, which means divine lord. The king was seen as a semi-divine figure, a mediator between the human world and the world of the gods. He was responsible for communicating with the gods, for ensuring cosmic order, for leading in warfare. Below the king were the nobles, the people who owned land, who controlled trade, who held positions in the government and the military. These nobles lived in fancy stone houses, wore elaborate jewelry and clothing, had access to luxury goods like chocolate and jade and quetzal feathers. Below the nobles were various levels of commoners. There were specialized artisans, scribes, merchants, people who had valuable skills but weren't noble. And then there were the farmers, the vast majority of the population, the people who grew the food that fed everyone. And at the very bottom were slaves, people who had been captured in war or who had been sold into slavery for debt or who had been born into slavery. Slaves had no rights, they were property, and they could be worked to death, sacrificed, or killed at the whim of their owners. This social structure meant that most Maya people had very little control over their own lives. If you were born a farmer, you'd die a farmer. There was very little social mobility. You worked for the nobles, you paid them tribute, you provided labor service when they demanded it, you fought in their wars.
and in return, they theoretically protected you and maintained order. But if a noble wanted your land, they could take it. If they wanted your labor, they could demand it. If they wanted to sacrifice you, well, that was less common for regular citizens, but it could happen, especially if you were a criminal or if you'd somehow offended the gods or the rulers. And speaking of criminals, let's talk about Maya justice, because it was harsh. The Maya had laws, and they took them seriously. Different cities and regions had different specific laws, but there were some common themes. Murder was punished by death, usually. Adultery could be punished by death, especially for women and especially if the woman was married to a nobleman. Theft was taken seriously. If you stole something, you might have to pay restitution, maybe several times the value of what you stole. If you couldn't pay, you might be enslaved. For serious crimes, punishments could be brutal. Mutilation was used. You might have your nose cut off or your ears cut off as a permanent mark of your crime. You might be publicly humiliated, tied up in the town square for everyone to mock. For the worst crimes, you might be tortured before being executed. There were no prisons as we understand them, no long-term incarceration. Justice was swift and often brutal. And it wasn't always fair. If you were accused of a crime by a noble, you were probably going to be found guilty whether you actually did it or not. The nobles had all the power, and the commoners had to just accept whatever judgment was handed down. Now let's talk about something that affected everyone, from the king to the lowliest slave: the environment. The Maya lived in a challenging environment. The tropical lowlands where most of the great Maya cities were built are hot and humid year-round. The dry season, from about November to May, brings months without rain. Rivers can dry up, water sources can become scarce, crops can wither. And then the rainy season, from about May to October, brings torrential downpours, flooding, diseases that flourish in the wet conditions. Hurricanes were a threat. These massive storms could devastate cities, destroy crops, flood fields, knock down buildings. And the Maya had no warning systems, no meteorology, no way to prepare beyond what they could guess from the sky and the wind. The Maya were also vulnerable to droughts, and I mean serious droughts that could last for years or even decades. There's strong evidence that a series of prolonged droughts in the 9th and 10th centuries played a major role in the collapse of classic Maya civilization. When the rains failed, crops failed. When crops failed, people starved. When people starved, social order broke down. Cities were abandoned, populations crashed. The great kingdoms of the classic period fell apart. This wasn't a sudden apocalypse, it was a slow, grinding decline as water sources dried up, as fields turned to dust, as people grew desperate and hungry.
Imagine living through something like that. You're a farmer, and this year the rains came late. Your corn didn't grow as well as it should have. Okay, it happens. You tighten your belt. You make do with less. Next year, the rains are even less. The corn harvest is bad again. You're hungry now. Actually hungry. Not just eating less than you'd like, but genuinely not getting enough food. Your children are thin. Your wife is weak.
Third year, barely any rain at all. The corn mostly dies. The lords have taken what food there is for themselves and their supporters. You're starving now. Your youngest child dies of malnutrition or disease, their little body unable to fight off illness without adequate food. You make the decision to abandon your home, the place your family has lived for generations, and you walk, looking for somewhere, anywhere where there might be food. But everywhere you go, it's the same story: drought, crop failure, starvation. This is what happened to many Maya during the collapse. It was absolutely brutal. The Maya also faced threats from animals. Jaguars roamed the forests, and while they usually avoided humans, they could attack, especially if they were hungry or if you encountered one by surprise. Venomous snakes were common. Coral snakes, pit vipers, fer-de-lances. These snakes could deliver bites that caused terrible pain, tissue damage, and death if you didn't get treatment. And there was no antivenom. If you got bitten, you relied on healers who might know plants that could help with the symptoms. But a lot of the time, if you got a bad bite, you were just going to die a slow, painful death as the venom did its work. Crocodiles lived in the rivers and cenotes. scorpions, and spiders could deliver painful or even dangerous stings and bites. Even insects were a serious problem. Mosquitoes weren't just annoying, they carried diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Flies spread disease. Ticks could transmit infections. Living in the Maya world meant constantly being on guard against nature. Let's talk about childhood, because even before you were old enough to work in the fields or grind corn, life was tough. Maya children started working young. By the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to help out with age-appropriate tasks. Girls would start learning from their mothers how to grind corn, make tortillas, weave cloth, tend to younger siblings. Boys would start learning from their fathers how to farm, how to hunt, how to fish. By their early teens, children were doing adult work. There was no childhood as we understand it, no years of carefree play and education. You grew up fast because you had to. Education for commoner children was informal. You learned by watching and doing. Your parents taught you what you needed to know to survive and to do your job in Maya society. Noble children had it a bit different. They might be taught by priests or specialized teachers. They'd learn to read and write, which was a specialized skill that few people mastered. The Maya writing system was complex, using hundreds of glyphs that could represent sounds or whole words or ideas. Learning to read and write took years of study. Noble children would also be taught history, astronomy, mathematics, religious rituals. They were being prepared to take their place in the ruling class. But even noble children faced hardships. They underwent the cranial modification I mentioned earlier. They were taught that their lives were dedicated to serving the gods and their city. Sons of kings knew that someday they might have to lead warriors into battle, might have to perform painful bloodletting rituals, might have to make terrible decisions about war and sacrifice. Daughters of nobles knew they'd be married off for political alliances, sent to live in foreign cities with husbands they'd probably never met before the wedding, expected to produce heirs and cement relationships between dynasties. And marriages among commoners weren't exactly romantic either. Marriages were arranged by families. You married who your parents told you to marry, usually someone from your own social class, someone from your own community. The marriage wasn't about love, it was about economics, about combining resources, about producing children who could help with the work. Not that love couldn't develop, of course it could, and often did, but it wasn't the basis for the marriage. And divorce was possible, but it was difficult and socially messy, so most people stuck with their marriages even if they were unhappy. Women in Maya society had it particularly rough. Yes, some women, especially noble women, could have significant power. There were Maya queens who ruled in their own right, who led their cities, who were warriors and political leaders. But for most women, life was a constant grind of domestic work, childbearing, and submission to male authority. Women were expected to be obedient to their fathers, then to their husbands, then if they were widowed, to their adult sons. They had few legal rights. They couldn't own property in most cases. They were valued primarily for their ability to produce children and to work. And let's think about childbirth for a moment. Giving birth in the ancient Maya world was dangerous. Women gave birth at home, usually assisted by a midwife and female relatives. There were no hospitals, no doctors in the modern sense, no painkillers beyond maybe some herbal remedies. Labor could last for hours or days. Complications were common. If the baby was in the wrong position, if there was heavy bleeding, if there was an infection, there was little that could be done. Women died in childbirth regularly. Babies died during birth or shortly after. And even if both mother and baby survived the birth, the postpartum period was risky. Infections could set in. The mother might develop fever and die days or weeks after giving birth. The baby might fail to thrive, might not be able to nurse properly, might succumb to any number of diseases. And if you did survive childbirth, if you made it through infancy and childhood, you could look forward to a life of hard physical labor. Your body would wear out. By your 30s, you'd probably have arthritis in your joints from years of kneeling and bending and lifting. Your teeth would be worn down and probably riddled with cavities. Your back would ache constantly. You'd have scars from injuries, from accidents in the field or around the house. You might be partially deaf from years of infection. You might have vision problems. you'd be old at an age when modern people are still considered young. Now, let's talk about clothing, because what the Maya wore tells us a lot about their lives. For most common people, clothing was simple and functional. Men wore a loincloth, basically a strip of cloth wrapped around the waist and between the legs. In cooler weather or for special occasions, they might wear a simple tunic or cloak. Women wore a huipil, a loose-fitting dress that was basically a large rectangle of cloth with holes cut for the head and arms. They might also wear a wraparound skirt. The cloth was usually made from cotton, which the Maya grew and spun and wove by hand. Every piece of clothing represented hours and hours of work. Women would spin cotton into thread using a simple hand spindle, just a stick with a weight on it that you'd spin while drawing out the cotton fibers. Then they'd weave the thread into cloth on a backstrap loom, a simple loom where one end is tied to a tree or post and the other end is tied around the weaver's waist. The weaver controls the tension with her body, leaning back to tighten the threads, leaning forward to loosen them. It's slow, painstaking work. A single piece of cloth for a huipil might take weeks to weave. For nobles, clothing was much more elaborate. They wore cotton cloth dyed in bright colors, reds from cochineal insects, blues from indigo plants, purples from shellfish. Their clothes would be decorated with embroidery, with woven patterns, with jade beads and shells. They wore elaborate headdresses made from quetzal feathers, which were incredibly valuable. The quetzal is a bird with long, brilliant green tail feathers, and these feathers were reserved for royalty. Nobles wore jade jewelry, jade being more valuable to the Maya than gold. They wore ear spools, large cylindrical ornaments that fit through stretched holes in their earlobes. They wore nose ornaments, lip plugs, all kinds of body modifications and decorations that marked their status. But even nobles dealt with discomfort. Those ear spools required stretching the earlobes, which was done gradually over time and was painful. The heavy headdresses that nobles wore for ceremonies were hot and uncomfortable. The jade jewelry, while beautiful, was heavy, and the elaborate body paint and tattoos that many Maya people wore, both nobles and commoners, were painful to apply. Tattoos were done by cutting designs into the skin and then rubbing in pigment, basically scarification. It hurt like hell and carried a risk of infection, but it was a mark of identity, of belonging to a particular group or class. Let's talk about religion in more depth now, because religion permeated every aspect of Maya life, and it demanded constant attention and sacrifice from everyone. The Maya believed in a complex cosmos with multiple layers. There was the earth, the middle world where humans lived. Above the earth were 13 layers of heaven, home to various gods and celestial bodies. Below the earth were 9 layers of the underworld called Xibalba, a dark and dangerous place ruled by death gods. And all of these realms were interconnected. The Maya believed that the world had been created and destroyed multiple times. They were living in the 4th or 5th creation, depending on which text you read. And this creation was maintained by a delicate balance that required constant human effort. The gods needed to be fed, and their food was blood. This wasn't symbolic. The Maya believed literally the gods required blood sacrifice to survive and to continue doing their jobs of making the sun rise, bringing rain, ensuring that crops grew. So sacrifice wasn't just some occasional ritual, it was a constant necessity. Every significant event, every important date in the Maya calendar, every new construction project, every military victory, all of these required sacrifice. And while the most dramatic sacrifices involved captured enemies, day-to-day religious observance involved regular bloodletting by priests and nobles, offerings of food and incense, rituals that took up enormous amounts of time and resources. The Maya calendar system was incredibly complex and was central to their religious life. They actually used multiple calendars simultaneously. There was the Hab, a solar calendar with 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days at the end, for a total of 365 days. There was the Tzolk'in, a sacred calendar of 260 days, made up of 13 numbers combined with 20 day names. These two calendars would mesh together like gears, and any given day would have both a Hab date and a Tzolk'in date. It took 52 years for the two calendars to return to the same combination, and the completion of this 52-year cycle was a major event that required special ceremonies and sacrifices. The Maya also used the long count, a linear count of days from a starting point in 3114 BCE. This allowed them to record historical dates and to make calculations far into the past and future. Maya scribes could calculate dates thousands of years in the past or future, and they recorded these dates on their monuments and in their books. They were obsessed with time, with cycles, with the patterns of the cosmos. And all of this required a class of priests and scribes who spent their lives studying the calendars, making calculations, determining which days were lucky or unlucky, figuring out when to plant crops, when to go to war, when to perform ceremonies. And these ceremonies were elaborate and time-consuming. A major ceremony might last for days. There'd be processions, dancing, music, offerings, bloodletting, sacrifice. The entire population of a city might be involved, either as participants or as spectators. People would fast beforehand, abstaining from certain foods or from sex. They'd dress in special ceremonial clothing. Priests would wear elaborate costumes representing various gods. There'd be the burning of copal incense, which created thick clouds of smoke. There'd be ritual drinking of balche, an alcoholic beverage made from fermented honey and tree bark. People would dance until they were exhausted, sometimes for hours, working themselves into altered states of consciousness. The Maya believed that certain people could communicate directly with the gods and the ancestors. Shamans would use various techniques to enter trance states. They'd fast for days, depriving themselves of food and water. They'd engage in sleep deprivation. They'd use psychoactive substances, plants like morning glory seeds or mushrooms that contained compounds that altered consciousness. In these trance states, shamans believed they could travel to the spirit world, could speak with gods and ancestors, could divine the future, could heal the sick. And whether or not these experiences were literally real, they were certainly real to the people experiencing them and to the communities that relied on them. The underworld, Xibalba, was a place of testing and terror in Maya belief. When you died, your soul had to journey through Xibalba, facing various challenges and trials set by the death gods. There were rivers of blood and pus to cross. There were houses filled with jaguars, with bats, with knives. The death gods would try to trick you, to defeat you. If you failed the tests, you'd be destroyed. Your soul would cease to exist. If you passed the tests, you might be reborn, or you might join the ancestors, or your fate might depend on how you died. Warriors who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were believed to have special fates, accompanying the sun on its daily journey across the sky. This belief in the dangerous journey after death meant that the Maya took funerary practices very seriously. When someone died, their body would be wrapped and prepared. Nobles would be buried with grave goods, things they'd need in the afterlife: food, water, tools, weapons, jewelry. Sometimes servants or even wives would be killed and buried with an important lord to serve him in the afterlife. The body might be placed in a tomb beneath a temple or pyramid. For commoners, burial was simpler, maybe just wrapped in a mat and placed in a simple grave, but still with some offerings of food and basic tools. The Maya also sometimes buried people beneath the floors of their own houses, keeping ancestors close, maintaining that connection between the living and the dead. Let's talk about trade now, because the Maya world was connected by extensive trade networks, and participating in trade was another aspect of life that could be both opportunity and hardship. The Maya traded all over Mesoamerica. Long-distance merchants called pupolam would organize trading expeditions that could last for months. They'd gather together trade goods, things that were valuable and could be exchanged: cacao beans, which were used as currency and were also made into chocolate drink; cotton cloth, obsidian blades and tools; jade, feathers from tropical birds; salt from coastal areas; honey, copal incense, animal skins. They'd load all of this onto their backs or onto the backs of enslaved porters because, remember, no pack animals. And they'd walk for weeks or months, following established trade routes through the jungle and mountains, to distant cities where they could exchange their goods for other valuable items. This was dangerous work. Traders faced all the natural hazards of travel, the animals, the diseases, the possibility of getting lost or injured far from home. They also faced human dangers. Bandits might attack a trading party, killing the merchants and stealing their goods. Hostile cities might refuse to allow traders to pass or might seize their goods. The traders themselves were often used as spies. A merchant traveling to a rival city would bring back information about that city's defenses, its population, its resources. So merchants were valuable but also potentially dangerous people. They occupied a strange position in Maya society, commoners by birth but often wealthy from trade, traveling freely between cities that might be at war with each other. The trade routes themselves were incredible achievements. The Maya built Sakbayab, white roads, raised limestone causeways that connected cities. Some of these roads were dozens of miles long, cutting straight through the jungle. Building them required moving massive amounts of stone and earth, and maintaining them required constant work, because the jungle was always trying to reclaim them. But these roads allowed for easier travel and trade. They were wide enough for processions, for merchants with their loads, for messengers running between cities.
And there were coastal trade routes too. The Maya built canoes, large dugout canoes carved from single massive tree trunks. These canoes could be 40 or 50 feet long and could carry several tons of cargo and a crew of paddlers. Maya merchants would paddle these canoes along the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, trading with coastal cities, venturing out onto the open sea. This was risky. Storms could swamp a canoe, pirates might attack, but the potential profits were enormous. A successful trading voyage could make a merchant wealthy. Cacao was one of the most valuable trade goods, and it's worth talking about specifically because it was so important to the Maya. Cacao beans, which we used to make chocolate, were currency for the Maya. You could buy things with cacao beans. A rabbit might cost 10 beans. A slave might cost 100 beans. But cacao was also food, or rather drink. The Maya would roast and grind cacao beans, mix them with water, add chili peppers and other spices, and create a bitter, spicy chocolate drink. This wasn't the sweet, hot chocolate we're used to. This was intensely flavored, often mixed with maize gruel, and it was reserved primarily for the elite. Nobles would drink chocolate at feasts and ceremonies. It was a status symbol. Common people might taste chocolate once in their lives, if ever. Growing cacao was hard work. Cacao trees are finicky. They need shade, they need specific climate conditions, they need careful tending. The trees don't produce beans for several years after planting. The beans have to be harvested by hand, fermented, dried, all labor-intensive processes. So cacao plantations required significant labor investment. And because cacao was so valuable, controlling cacao-producing regions gave cities and kingdoms significant economic power. Salt was another crucial trade item. Inland Maya cities needed salt, both for food preservation and for human health. But salt had to come from coastal areas, either from salt pans where seawater evaporated leaving salt behind, or from salt springs. Controlling salt sources was economically and politically important. Cities that had access to salt could trade it to inland cities for other goods. Salt traders would carry heavy loads of salt in baskets on their backs, walking for days or weeks to reach inland markets. Obsidian was essential because it was the primary material for cutting tools and weapons. But obsidian is volcanic glass, so it's only found in volcanic regions. The lowland Maya lands don't have volcanoes, so all the obsidian that the lowland Maya cities used had to be imported from the highlands of Guatemala and Mexico. There were specific obsidian sources, quarries where the volcanic glass could be mined, and the people who controlled these quarries controlled the flow of this essential material. Obsidian workers were skilled craftsmen who knew how to flake obsidian, how to create blades and points and tools from the raw material. This was specialized knowledge passed down through families. Jade was perhaps the most precious material to the Maya, even more valuable than gold. The Maya had some gold, especially in later periods through trade, but they didn't value it as highly as jade. Jade was sacred. It represented water, vegetation, life itself. The word for jade was the same as the word for precious or valuable. Jade was used for jewelry, for ritual objects, for offerings to the gods. The most beautiful jade objects were carved with incredible skill, showing gods or rulers or scenes from mythology. But jade is extremely hard, one of the hardest natural materials, and the Maya had to carve it using sand and water and cord, basically abrading it away bit by bit. A single carved jade pendant might take months or years to complete. Feathers from tropical birds were another luxury trade item. Quetzal feathers, as I mentioned, were reserved for royalty, but there were other valuable feathers too. Scarlet macaw feathers, brilliant red and blue and yellow, were used in headdresses and capes. These birds had to be captured alive, often as chicks, and raised in captivity so their feathers could be harvested. Or they had to be hunted in the wild, which was difficult and dangerous. Hunters would venture deep into the rainforest, climbing trees to reach nests, using blowguns or snares to capture birds without damaging their valuable plumage. Now let's talk about specific cities, because understanding the major Maya cities helps us understand the diversity and complexity of Maya civilization. Each city was essentially an independent state, with its own ruling dynasty, its own patron gods, its own history and traditions. Some cities were allies, connected by trade and marriage alliances. Others were bitter enemies, engaged in generations-long conflicts. Tikal was one of the greatest Maya cities, located in what's now Guatemala. At its height during the Classic period, Tikal had a population of maybe 50,000 to 100,000 people, spread over about 50 square miles. The city center had massive pyramids, the tallest over 200 feet high. The Temple of the Great Jaguar, one of Tikal's most famous structures, was a tomb for a king named Jasau Chan Kawil, who ruled in the late 7th century. This king's body was buried deep in the pyramid in a chamber filled with jade and ceramics and other precious objects. But think about what it took to build this pyramid. Hundreds of thousands of blocks of stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported to the site, and lifted into place. Thousands of workers labored for years to build this one tomb. And Tikal has dozens of major structures, hundreds of smaller ones. The amount of human effort that went into building this city is staggering.
Tikal was at war for much of its history. It fought with its neighbors, especially with a city called Calakmul, located about 60 miles to the north. These two cities were the superpowers of the classic Maya world, and they dragged other cities into their conflicts, creating a complex web of alliances and enmities. Wars between Tikal and Calakmul could last for generations. Kings would lead their warriors on campaigns, would celebrate victories with elaborate ceremonies and sacrifices of captured enemies, would suffer defeats that weakened their power and prestige. Palenque, located in the modern Mexican state of Chiapas, was another great city, though smaller than Tikal. Palenque is famous for its beautiful architecture and for the tomb of Kinich Janab Pakal, usually called Pakal the Great, who ruled for 68 years in the 7th century. When Pakal died, his body was buried in a tomb deep inside a pyramid called the Temple of the Inscriptions. His body was placed in an elaborately carved stone sarcophagus, wearing a jade mosaic mask, his face covered in jade. The tomb was sealed and the pyramid was built over it. When archaeologists discovered this tomb in the 1950s, it was one of the most spectacular finds in Maya archaeology. But again, think about the human cost. All that stone had to be moved. The intricate carvings had to be done by hand with stone tools. The jade mask required thousands of tiny pieces of jade, each one cut and polished and drilled. Copan, in what's now Honduras, was known for its sculpture and its intellectual achievements. Copan had a court of scribes and astronomers who made detailed observations of the sky, who refined the Maya calendar system, who created some of the most beautiful hieroglyphic inscriptions anywhere in the Maya world. But Copan also had problems. The city grew large, maybe 20,000 people, and it started to strain its environment. The forests around Copan were cut down for farmland and for construction. The soil eroded. By the 9th century, Copan was in decline. The last monuments erected there show a city in crisis, rulers unable to complete the grand projects their ancestors had undertaken. Eventually, Copan was abandoned, the jungle slowly reclaiming the temples and palaces. Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan was one of the most important cities of the later Maya period. Chichen Itza flourished when many southern cities were in decline or abandoned. The city shows a mix of Maya and Central Mexican influences, suggesting significant interaction between the Maya and other Mesoamerican peoples, possibly the Toltecs. Chichen Itza has the famous pyramid called El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan, which demonstrates incredible astronomical knowledge. On the spring and fall equinoxes, the angle of the sun creates a shadow pattern on the pyramid's staircase that looks like a serpent descending from the top. This was intentional, designed into the building, showing how precisely the Maya understood the movements of the sun. Chichen Itza also has the largest ball court in Mesoamerica, over 500 feet long. The walls of this ball court are covered with carvings showing the ball game and its ritual significance. And there's the sacred cenote, the deep natural sinkhole where thousands of objects were thrown as offerings over hundreds of years. When archaeologists dredged this cenote in the early 20th century, they found jade, gold, pottery, and human bones, the remains of sacrificial victims thrown into the water. If you're still with me on this journey through Maya history, I really appreciate you taking this time to learn about this fascinating civilization here on Dreamless Timelines. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to support more deep dives into history like this one, and drop a comment about what civilization or historical period you'd like to explore next. Now, let's continue our journey as we explore more about daily life in these remarkable cities. Uxmal, also in the Yucatan, was another major late city, known for its distinctive architecture. The buildings at Uxmal have a style called puk, characterized by smooth lower walls and elaborately decorated upper facades. The Pyramid of the Magician at Uxmal has an unusual oval base, different from most Maya pyramids, and according to legend, it was built in a single night by a dwarf magician. Obviously, that's mythology, not reality, but it speaks to how impressive the structure was to later people who saw it. These cities weren't isolated. They were connected by those roads, by trade routes, by diplomatic relations. Maya nobles would travel from city to city for marriages, for ceremonies, for diplomatic meetings. Messengers would run along the roads carrying news and messages. Professional traders would move between cities with their goods. There was a sense of shared Maya culture, shared language, though with regional dialects, shared religious beliefs, shared artistic traditions. But there was also intense competition and conflict between cities. Being Maya didn't mean being united. It meant being part of a complex, often fractious world of city-states, each jealously guarding its independence and prestige. Now let's talk about what daily life actually looked like for a regular person. Let's imagine a typical day for a Maya farmer, let's call him Kin, living in a small village a few miles from a major city during the Classic period. Kin wakes up before dawn. His wife, Ixchel, is already awake, has been awake for an hour or more, grinding corn for the day's tortillas. He can hear the rhythmic scraping sound of the mano on the metate. He gets up from his sleeping mat, steps outside into the cool pre-dawn air. The first thing he does is check the weather. Are there clouds? Any sign of rain? It's been dry lately, and everyone's worried. The corn in the fields is starting to look stressed.
Kin relieves himself in the woods behind his house, then goes to the water jar to wash his face and hands. The water is getting low. His daughter will have to walk to the cenote later to fill the jars, a round trip of about an hour, carrying heavy pottery jars full of water. He eats a quick breakfast, some leftover tortillas from yesterday and some beans. His stomach growls. The portions have been getting smaller. The harvest last year wasn't great, and they're having to ration their stored corn carefully to make it last until the next harvest. As the sun starts to rise, Kin picks up his digging stick and his bag of seed corn, and he heads out to his field. It's about a 20-minute walk from his house, through the village, past other houses where his neighbors are also getting ready for the day, and then along a narrow trail through some regrowth forest to his field. The field is about 2 acres and it's planted in corn with squash and beans growing between the corn plants. This is the traditional Maya system, the 3 sisters as it's sometimes called. The corn provides stalks for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, helping to fertilize the corn. The squash spreads out along the ground, shading the soil and keeping weeds down. Kin spends the morning weeding and checking his plants. He finds some corn borer worms, fat caterpillars that are eating the corn leaves. He picks them off and crushes them. He finds some places where the soil is dry and cracked. He's worried. If it doesn't rain soon, he's going to lose a significant portion of his crop. He says a prayer to Chok, the rain god, asking for rain, promising an offering if the rain comes. By midday, the sun is blazing and he's drenched in sweat. He finds some shade and rests for a while, drinking from a gourd of water he brought with him, eating a couple of tortillas his wife wrapped for him. In the afternoon, Kin has to leave his own field because he's required to report for labor service. The lord of the nearby city is building a new platform for a temple, and all the men from Kin's village have been told to report for work. So Kin walks to the city center, joins a crew of maybe 100 other men, all farmers like him, and they spend the afternoon carrying stones. There's a quarry about half a mile away, and the men work in teams, carrying stones on litters, basically poles with the stone tied in the middle and a man at each end of the poles. The stones weigh maybe 100 pounds each. Kin and his partner, a guy from the next village over, carry stone after stone after stone from the quarry to the construction site. Their shoulders ache from the weight of the poles. Their feet hurt from walking on the rough ground. The overseer, a minor noble, walks around shouting at anyone who's slacking off, occasionally striking someone with a stick if they're not moving fast enough. Finally, as the sun starts to get low in the sky, the overseer releases them. Kin walks home, exhausted, every muscle in his body screaming. When he gets home, his wife has dinner ready. More tortillas, some squash from their garden, a little bit of chili pepper for flavor. After dinner, Kin and his family sit outside for a while. His wife is weaving by the light of a small fire. She's making a new huipil from their daughter, who's growing fast and whose old dress is getting too small. Kin's son, who's about 10 years old, is practicing with a small blowgun, shooting clay pellets at a target, learning to hunt. Their younger daughter is playing with a doll made from corn husks. As darkness falls, Kin and his family go inside. They don't have any artificial light beyond the embers of the cooking fire. There are no lamps, no candles, nothing like that for common people. So when the sun goes down, you basically go to bed. Kin lies down on his sleeping mat. His body aches. He's tired in a way that goes deep into his bones. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. This is his life, day after day, year after year, until he's too old or too sick to work anymore, and then he'll depend on his children to take care of him. He thinks about his corn crop, about the lack of rain, about what will happen if the harvest fails. He worries about his family, about keeping them fed and safe. Eventually, exhausted, he falls asleep. And then, a few hours later, his wife wakes up and starts grinding corn, and the cycle begins again.
This was the reality for the vast majority of Maya people. Constant work, constant worry about food and water, constant obligations to the nobles, very little leisure time, very little comfort. Yes, there were feast days, religious festivals when work stopped and there was food and drink and dancing. Yes, there were moments of joy, births and marriages and small victories. But the overall texture of life was hardship, a constant struggle against nature, against hunger, against the demands of the ruling class. And if you think the nobles had it easy, well, they had it easier than the commoners for sure, but they had their own burdens. A Maya king, for example, was expected to be a warrior, a priest, a diplomat, a judge, basically the embodiment of his city. He had to lead his warriors into battle, personally fighting and risking his life. He had to perform elaborate bloodletting rituals, deliberately causing himself pain to show his devotion to the gods. He had to make difficult decisions about war and peace, about allocating resources, about punishing criminals. And if things went wrong, if the crops failed, or if the city lost a war, the king was blamed. He was responsible for maintaining cosmic order, for keeping the gods happy. If the gods seemed displeased, if there was drought or disease or defeat, people would question the king's legitimacy, his divine right to rule. There are cases in Maya history where kings were overthrown, deposed by rivals or by their own nobles. There are cases where dynasties ended, royal lines dying out or being extinguished in wars. Being a Maya king could bring power and prestige, but it also brought enormous pressure and danger. And noble women, while they had more status than commoner women, were also constrained. They were political pawns, married off to seal alliances. They were expected to produce heirs, and if they couldn't, they might be set aside. Yes, some noble women wielded real power, but they were the exception, not the rule. Let's talk about the collapse now, because this is one of the most fascinating and tragic aspects of Maya history. During the 8th and 9th century CE, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands began to fail. One by one, the kingdoms that had flourished for centuries went into decline. Construction stopped. Kings stopped erecting monuments proclaiming their achievements. Populations shrank. Cities were abandoned. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It happened over about a century and a half, but by around 950 CE, most of the great southern cities, places like Tikal and Palenque and Kopan, were essentially ghost towns, the temples and palaces empty, the fields returning to jungle. What happened? This is a question that archaeologists and historians have been trying to answer for decades, and the truth is it was probably a combination of factors, not any one single cause. Climate change played a role. There's strong evidence from lake sediments and other geological records that the Maya region experienced a series of severe droughts during the Terminal Classic period. The rains failed year after year, decade after decade. This would have been catastrophic for Maya agriculture, which depended on adequate rainfall. Crops would have failed, water sources would have dried up, people would have starved. But drought alone probably doesn't explain the collapse, because the Maya had survived droughts before. There were other factors at play. Overpopulation was likely a problem. During the Classic period, Maya populations had grown large, maybe denser than the land could sustainably support. Remember that slash-and-burn agricultural system I described? It requires a lot of land because you have to let fields regenerate. When populations get too dense, you can't do that. You have to use fields more frequently, which depletes the soil, which reduces crop yields. There's evidence that by the late Classic period, Maya farmers were struggling with soil exhaustion, deforestation, and erosion. They were damaging their own environment, degrading the resource base they depended on. Warfare probably intensified the problems. As resources got scarcer, cities fought more viciously over what was left. Trade routes were disrupted. Rival cities raided each other's fields, burning crops, killing farmers. The constant warfare consumed resources, pulled men away from agricultural work, created instability that made it harder for societies to respond to crises. And political systems started to break down. When the rains didn't come, when crops failed, when the gods seemed to have abandoned them, people lost faith in their rulers. If the king's job was to maintain cosmic order and keep the gods happy, and the gods clearly weren't happy, then maybe the king had failed. There's some evidence that in the final years of some cities, kings stopped erecting monuments, stopped proclaiming their divine authority. Maybe they were overthrown. Maybe they just lost the ability to command the labor and resources needed for those grand displays.
Disease may have played a role too. When populations are stressed by malnutrition, when social systems are breaking down, diseases can spread more easily and can be more deadly. There's no direct evidence of any specific plague or epidemic, but it's possible that disease outbreaks contributed to population decline. So you can imagine what it must have been like to live through the collapse. You're a farmer, and each year the harvests get worse. Your children are thin and hungry. The lords demand tribute and labor even as their own power weakens. Other cities raid your fields. Violence becomes more common. People start leaving, abandoning their homes, trying to find somewhere better. Maybe you decide to leave too.
You pack up what you can carry and you walk away from the home your family has lived in for generations. You head north or east towards cities that haven't collapsed yet, hoping to find refuge. This actually happened. Many people from the southern lowlands migrated north to the Yucatan or east to coastal areas, looking for better conditions. The northern cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal continued to flourish for several more centuries, in part because they had better access to water from cenotes. But in the south, the great cities fell silent. The temples and pyramids, those monuments to Maya achievement, were gradually swallowed by the jungle. Trees grew on top of pyramids, vines covered the carved facades, roofs collapsed. For centuries, these ruins sat hidden in the rainforest, known only to local people, until European explorers and archaeologists began rediscovering them in the 19th century. It's important to understand, though, that the collapse wasn't the end of the Maya people. The Maya didn't disappear. They're still here. There are millions of Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras today, speaking Maya languages, maintaining cultural traditions that stretch back thousands of years. What collapsed was the classic Maya civilization, the political and cultural system centered on the great southern cities. But Maya culture continued in the northern cities, and it continued in smaller communities scattered throughout the Maya area. And Maya people endured through the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, through colonialism, through all the challenges of the modern world. They survived. Let's talk now about Maya astronomy and mathematics, because even in the midst of all the hardship we've been discussing, the Maya made incredible intellectual achievements. They were among the finest astronomers in the ancient world. Without telescopes, without any optical instruments at all, Maya astronomers made detailed observations of the sky and discovered patterns in cycles that are remarkably accurate. They tracked the movements of Venus with incredible precision. Venus was especially important to the Maya. They associated it with warfare and sacrifice. They timed military campaigns to coincide with certain positions of Venus. Maya astronomers knew that Venus has a cycle of 584 days, after which it returns to the same position relative to the Earth and Sun. This is accurate to within hours of the true astronomical value. They tracked the movements of the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They understood that solar eclipses occurred in predictable patterns. They could predict when eclipses would happen, which must have seemed like powerful magic to people who didn't understand the science behind it. Imagine being able to tell people months in advance that on a specific day, the sun is going to go dark in the middle of the day, and then having it actually happen. That's real power, knowledge as power. The Maya built observatories, buildings specifically designed for astronomical observation. At Chichen Itza, there's a circular building called El Caracol, the snail, because of its interior spiral staircase. This building has windows and openings that align with important astronomical events, the setting points of Venus at its extreme positions, the position of the sun at the equinoxes. Astronomers would sit in this building night after night, watching the sky, recording what they saw. And they did this for generations, building up an enormous body of astronomical data. They recorded all of this information in books called codices. These were books made from bark paper, folded like a screen, covered with writing and images. The Maya wrote in their hieroglyphic script, which is one of the most sophisticated writing systems ever developed. It uses a combination of phonetic symbols, signs that represent sounds, and logograms, signs that represent whole words or concepts. Maya scribes could write anything in their script, from historical records to poetry to astronomical calculations. Learning to read and write Maya hieroglyphs took years of training. It was a specialized skill, and scribes were highly valued. Tragically, when the Spanish conquered the Maya region in the 16th century, they saw these books as tools of the devil, as pagan religious texts that needed to be destroyed. Spanish priests, particularly a bishop named Diego de Landa,
ordered the burning of Maya books. Thousands of codices were destroyed. Today, only 4 Maya codices survive. 4 books out of what must have been thousands. It's one of the greatest losses of cultural heritage in human history. We can only imagine what knowledge was lost in those fires, what histories, what literature, what scientific discoveries. The Maya were also mathematical geniuses. They developed the concept of zero independently, one of only a few civilizations in history to do so. Zero is a profound mathematical concept, and it's not obvious. You need zero for advanced mathematics, for place value notation. The Maya used a base 20 number system, unlike our base 10 system, and they could write very large numbers. They used 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and a shell shape for 0. With just these 3 symbols, they could write any number. They used mathematics for their astronomical calculations, for their calendar systems, for architecture and engineering. When they designed a pyramid, they used mathematical ratios and proportions. The pyramids weren't just piled up stones, they were precisely planned structures, with measurements and angles carefully calculated. Some pyramids encode astronomical and calendrical information in their dimensions. The number of steps, the width of the base, the height. These could all be significant numbers related to the calendar or to astronomical cycles. But here's the thing. All of this intellectual achievement, all of this astronomy and mathematics and writing, it was pursued within a society that was fundamentally brutal for most people. The scribes and astronomers were mostly nobles or priests, people who didn't have to spend their days growing corn or hauling stones. They had the leisure to study the sky because common people were doing the hard labor that fed and supported them. The books that were written, the few that survive, they're mostly about elite concerns, about kings and their deeds, about religious rituals, about the movements of celestial bodies. They don't tell us much about the lives of common people because common people couldn't write, and even if they could, their lives weren't considered important enough to record. Let's talk about the Spanish conquest because that's another period of brutal hardship for the Maya. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Maya lands in the early 16th century, they brought with them technologies and diseases that would devastate Maya societies. The Spanish had horses, which the Maya had never seen before. Imagine seeing a horse for the first time, this huge animal that a human can ride, that moves faster than any human runner. It must have seemed supernatural, terrifying. The Spanish also had guns, steel swords and armor, and war dogs. They had military tactics developed through centuries of European warfare. But the most devastating thing the Spanish brought was disease. The Maya had no immunity to European diseases like smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza. When these diseases arrived, they spread like wildfire through Maya populations. Smallpox was especially deadly. This disease causes fever, then a rash that turns into pustules all over the body. It's agonizing, and it kills maybe 30% of the people who catch it. Among populations with no immunity, the death rate could be even higher. Entire villages were wiped out. In some areas, half the population or more died within a few years of first contact with Europeans. The Spanish conquest of the Maya region took decades and was never really complete. The Maya fought back fiercely. They knew their territory, the jungles and swamps that the Spanish found difficult to navigate. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushing Spanish columns, then melting back into the forest. Some Maya cities resisted for years or decades. The city of Tayasal on an island in a lake in Guatemala held out until 1697, almost 200 years after the first Spanish contact. But eventually, Spanish military superiority, combined with the devastating effects of disease, led to the subjugation of most Maya territories. The Spanish imposed their own systems of government and religion on the Maya. They forced the Maya to convert to Christianity, destroying Maya temples and building churches on top of them. They banned Maya religious practices, though many Maya people continued to practice their traditional religion in secret. often blending it with Catholicism in ways that persist to this day. The Spanish established the encomienda system, which was basically slavery by another name. Spanish colonists were granted control over Maya communities and could force the Maya to work for them. Maya people were put to work on plantations, in mines, building Spanish cities. The labor was brutal, the conditions were terrible, and many Maya people died. And through all of this, Maya people endured. They adopted, they resisted when they could, they preserved what they could of their culture and language and traditions. There were rebellions, uprisings of Maya people against Spanish and later Mexican and Guatemalan rule. The caste war in the Yucatan in the mid-19th century saw Maya people rise up against Mexican control, and they actually succeeded in creating an independent Maya state that lasted for decades. Even today, Maya people continue to fight for their rights, for recognition of their languages and cultures, for control over their ancestral lands. Now let's talk about some specific aspects of daily life that we haven't covered yet. Let's talk about food in more detail, because what people ate tells us a lot about their lives. We've talked about corn, but let's talk about how it was actually consumed. The most common way to eat corn was as tortillas. After the corn was ground into dough, Maya women would take a ball of dough, pot it flat between their hands into a round disc, and cook it on a clay griddle called a comal. The tortilla would cook for a minute or two on each side, puffing up slightly, developing brown spots. Fresh tortillas are delicious, soft and warm, with a distinctive corn flavor, but they get hard and stale pretty quickly, so they had to be made fresh every day. Tamales were another common corn food. The corn dough would be mixed with water and sometimes with lard or meat or beans or chili peppers, then wrapped in corn husks or banana leaves and steamed. Tamales were convenient because they could be carried and eaten on the go, and they stayed edible for a day or two. They were good food for travelers, for warriors on campaign, for farmers working in distant fields. Atole was a corn drink, basically corn dough mixed with water and heated. It was like a thin gruel or porridge, and it was a common breakfast food. You could drink it plain, or you could flavor it with chili peppers or honey or cacao. It was filling, easy to digest, and quick to prepare, just mixing some of the corn dough that had been ground that morning with water and heating it up. Beans were the second most important food. Block beans, red beans, various types of beans were grown and eaten regularly. Beans are a great source of protein, and when combined with corn, they provide all the essential amino acids humans need. Beans would be boiled with water and maybe some herbs and chili peppers until they were soft. They could be eaten whole, or they could be mashed into a paste. Bean paste could be spread on tortillas or used as a filling for tamales. Squash was the third member of the traditional Maya agricultural triad. Squash could be boiled, roasted, or cooked in stews. The seeds were also eaten, roasted and eaten as a snack, or ground up and used in cooking. Squash flowers, the bright orange blossoms of the squash plant, were also eaten, usually cooked in stews or used to flavor other dishes. Nothing was wasted. Chili peppers were essential to Maya cuisine. The Maya grew many different varieties of chili peppers, from mild to extremely hot. Chili peppers added flavor, heat, and actually some vitamins to the diet. They were eaten fresh, dried, ground into powder, made into sauces. A meal without chili peppers would have been considered bland and unsatisfying. Tomatoes, avocados, and various other vegetables and fruits were also part of the Maya diet, though less central than corn, beans, and squash. The Maya had tomatoes long before they were introduced to Europe. They had several varieties of avocado, that creamy, fatty fruit that we love today. They had papaya, guava, and various other tropical fruits. For protein beyond beans, the Maya had some options, but not a lot. They didn't have large domesticated animals. They had turkeys, which they raised for food. Turkey meat was eaten on special occasions at feasts and ceremonies, but you couldn't eat turkey every day. It was too valuable. They also had dogs, and yes, the Maya ate dogs. Certain breeds of dogs were raised specifically for food. This might seem shocking to us since we think of dogs as pets,
But for the Maya, dogs were livestock, same as turkeys. The Maya hunted wild animals for meat. Deer were the most prized game, providing a lot of meat and valuable hides. But deer hunting was difficult and time-consuming. You might spend days in the forest tracking deer, using bows and arrows or atlatls, and you might come home empty-handed. Smaller game was more reliably available. The Maya hunted peccaries, which are like wild pigs, agoutis and pacas, which are large rodents, armadillos, iguanas, and various birds. They hunted with blowguns, using clay pellets or darts to bring down birds and small animals. The Maya also fished where they had access to water. Coastal Maya communities ate a lot of fish and shellfish. Inland communities might fish in rivers or cenotes, catching freshwater fish. Fish could be eaten fresh, or it could be dried and preserved, providing a protein source that could last for weeks or months. The Maya hunted wild animals for meat. Deer were the most prized game, providing a lot of meat and valuable hides. But deer hunting was difficult and time-consuming. You might spend days in the forest tracking deer, using bows and arrows or atlatls, and you might come home empty-handed. Smaller game was more reliably available. The Maya hunted peccaries, which are like wild pigs, agoutis and pacas, which are large rodents, armadillos, iguanas, and various birds. They hunted with blowguns, using clay pellets or darts to bring down birds and small animals. The Maya also fished where they had access to water. Coastal Maya communities ate a lot of fish and shellfish. Inland communities might fish in rivers or cenotes, catching freshwater fish. Fish could be eaten fresh, or it could be dried and preserved, providing a protein source that could last for weeks or months. The Maya also kept bees and harvested honey. Maya bees are stingless bees, smaller than honeybees, and they produce a honey that's less sweet and more liquid than honeybee honey. This honey was used as a sweetener, as medicine, and to make balche, that fermented alcoholic drink I mentioned earlier. But here's the thing about the Maya diet. For most people, most of the time, it was pretty monotonous and not particularly nutritious by modern standards. You'd eat corn tortillas with beans and maybe some chili peppers, day after day after day. Maybe once in a while you'd have some squash or some other vegetable. Maybe a few times a month you'd have some meat, if you were lucky. Feast days would bring more variety, more meat, more special foods. But on a regular day, you'd be eating basically the same simple meal you ate yesterday and the day before. And there were times when even that simple meal wasn't available. Crop failures, droughts, wars that disrupted farming, all of these could lead to food shortages or outright famine. When the corn ran out, people would eat anything they could find. They'd eat the less desirable parts of plants, tough roots and shoots. They'd eat insects, grubs, anything with calories. And if things got really bad, if the famine lasted long enough, people would starve. Children and the elderly would die first, their bodies unable to cope with severe malnutrition. Adults would become weak, susceptible to disease, unable to work. Famine could destroy communities. Let's talk about clothing and appearance in more detail now. We talked briefly about clothing earlier, but let's dig deeper into what people wore and how they presented themselves. For common men, that loincloth we mentioned was pretty much it for everyday wear. It was practical for the hot, humid climate. It allowed freedom of movement for physical labor. It was easy to wash and dry. But it also meant that most of your body was exposed to the elements, to insects, to the sun. Maya people would have been deeply tanned, their skin darkened by constant sun exposure. They'd have insect bites, scratches from vegetation, scars from accidents and injuries. Common women wore the huipil, that simple dress, and maybe a wrap skirt. Like the men's clothing, it was practical, made from cotton that was woven by hand. Making clothing was incredibly labor-intensive. First, you had to grow the cotton, then harvest it, then clean it, removing seeds and debris. Then you had to spin it into thread using a hand spindle, twirling the spindle and drawing out the cotton fibers into thread. This took hours and hours. Then you had to weave the thread into cloth on a backstrap loom, which also took hours and hours. And finally, you had to sew the cloth into clothing using a bone needle and thread. A single huipil might represent weeks of work, so people didn't have lots of changes of clothing. You might have 1 or 2 outfits, and you'd wear them until they wore out, patching and mending them as needed. For nobles, clothing was much more elaborate and was a key marker of status. Noble clothing was made from finer cotton, woven in intricate patterns. It was dyed in bright colors using natural dyes that were expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Cochineal, a red dye, came from insects that had to be cultivated and harvested. It took thousands of tiny insects to produce a small amount of dye. Indigo came from plants that had to be processed in a complex fermentation process. Purple dye came from certain shellfish and was incredibly valuable, reserved for the highest nobility. Noble clothing was also decorated with embroidery, with woven designs, with feathers sewn onto the cloth. Quetzal feathers, those long green feathers we talked about, were extraordinarily valuable. A single Quetzal feather might be worth more than a slave. Nobles would wear capes or cloaks decorated with hundreds of Quetzal feathers, creating a shimmering green effect that must have been stunning. They'd wear elaborate headdresses, towering constructions of feathers and jade and other precious materials. These headdresses could be several feet tall, and they must have been heavy and awkward to wear, but they were impressive, designed to make the wearer look larger than life, almost superhuman. Jewelry was another important marker of status. Nobles wore jade jewelry, jade ear spools, jade necklaces, jade bracelets, jade pendants. Remember, jade was more valuable than gold to the Maya. A large, finely carved jade ornament was worth a fortune. Nobles also wore shell jewelry, gold jewelry in later periods, copper jewelry. They wore nose ornaments, pieces of jade or shell or even bone inserted through a piercing in the septum. They wore lip plugs, ornaments that fit through a hole in the lower lip. These body modifications were permanent. Once you'd stretched your earlobes to fit large ear spools, once you'd pierced your septum or your lip, you couldn't undo it. You were marked for life as a member of the nobility. Tattoos and body paint were used by both commoners and nobles. Warriors would paint themselves before battle, using bright colors and frightening designs to intimidate enemies. Black and red were popular colors for war paint. Priests would paint themselves for ceremonies, sometimes covering their entire bodies in blue paint. Blue was sacred, associated with sacrifice and the rain god. Tattoos were permanent markings that showed group membership, achievements, status. Getting a tattoo was painful, involving cutting or puncturing the skin and rubbing in pigment, basically scarification. But people endured the pain because the markings were important, because they told the world who you were. Hairstyles were also meaningful. Different hairstyles indicated different statuses and roles. Warriors might wear their hair in a specific style. Priests might shave their heads or wear their hair long. Women generally wore their hair long, often braided or tied up. Hair might be decorated with beads or ribbons or flowers for special occasions. And people took care of their hair using plant-based products, oils and balms made from various seeds and nuts. Let's talk about the senses now, about what it would have been like to experience the Maya world with your eyes, ears, nose, and skin. Imagine the colors. The jungle is incredibly green, 1,000 shades of green, from the almost yellow-green of new leaves to the deep dark green of old-growth forest. The sky is brilliantly blue, the kind of deep, clear blue you only get in tropical regions. Maya buildings were painted in bright colors, reds and yellows and blues. The plaster that covered stone buildings was painted with murals showing gods and kings in mythological scenes, all in vivid, eye-catching colors. Nobles' clothing was brightly colored. Everything was more colorful, more visually intense than the muted tones we often imagine for the ancient world. Now, imagine the sounds. The jungle is loud. Howler monkeys roar in the early morning and late afternoon, their calls carrying for miles. Parrots and macaws screech and squawk. Countless other birds chirp and sing and call. Insects buzz and click and hum, a constant background noise. In the cities, you'd hear human sounds too. The grinding of corn on metates, that constant scraping sound in every household. The sound of stone tools on stone, masons shaping blocks for construction. The calls of merchants in markets, shouting out what they have for sale. The sound of drums and flutes during ceremonies, rhythmic, hypnotic music. The chanting of priests reciting prayers and invocations. The cries of children playing. The barking of dogs, the gobbling of turkeys, and sometimes the screams of sacrificial victims, sounds of terror and pain that must have echoed through the city centers. The smells. Smoke is everywhere in the Maya world. Cooking fires burning in every household, creating a haze of wood smoke. Copal incense burned during ceremonies, sweet and pungent. The smell of corn tortillas cooking, that distinctive, slightly sour smell of corn. The smell of sweat on human bodies working in the heat. The smell of the jungle, damp earth, rotting vegetation, flowers. Some Maya flowers smell amazing, sweet and perfumed. Others smell rotten because they're pollinated by flies and need to smell like decay to attract them. The smell of blood during sacrifices, metallic and distinctive. The smell of unwashed bodies because soap as we know it didn't exist, and bathing was done in rivers or cenotes using water and maybe some plant-based cleanser. The smell of excrement, because sanitation was poor and waste was often just thrown into the jungle or into pits near houses. The feel of things. Heat, constant heat if you're in the lowlands. The air is hot and thick with humidity. Sweat covers your body. Clothes stick to your skin. The ground is hot under your feet. In the rainy season, everything is wet. Clothes are damp. The ground is mud. Water drips from trees. Mosquitoes swarm. In the dry season, everything is dry and dusty. Your skin cracks. Your throat is parched. And always there's the physical sensation of labor, of muscles straining, of calluses on your hands, of aching backs and knees, of feet sore from walking on rough ground, of exhaustion that settles into your bones.
Let's talk about childhood diseases and injuries in more detail, because this was a major source of hardship. Children faced so many threats. Diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation killed countless children. A child would develop severe diarrhea, would lose fluids and electrolytes, would become dehydrated, and without modern treatments like oral rehydration solution or IV fluids, many children would die. Parents would watch helplessly as their child wasted away over a period of days. Respiratory infections were another major killer. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia, an infection in the lungs that made breathing difficult. Children would develop high fevers, would struggle to breathe, would cough constantly. Some would recover, many would die. There were no antibiotics, no way to fight the bacterial infections that caused pneumonia. Malnourishment weakened children, made them vulnerable to disease. A child who wasn't getting enough food, whose diet was deficient in proteins or vitamins, would have a weakened immune system. They'd catch every disease that came along, and they'd have a harder time fighting it off. Vitamin deficiencies could cause specific diseases. Lack of vitamin C caused scurvy, a disease that makes your gums bleed and your teeth fall out. Lack of vitamin D caused rickets, a disease that deforms your bones. Lack of niacin, which would happen if corn wasn't properly nixtamalized, caused pellagra, a disease that causes skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, and death. And there were probably childhood diseases we don't even know about, diseases that don't leave clear traces in the archaeological record. Whatever they were, they took their toll. The fact that 30 or 40% of children died before age 5 tells you everything you need to know about how dangerous childhood was in the ancient Maya world. For the children who survived, childhood was short. By age 5 or 6, you were working, helping your parents with age-appropriate tasks. By your early teens, you were doing adult work. And by your late teens, you were probably married and starting to have children of your own. There was no extended adolescence, no period of experimentation and finding yourself. You learned what you needed to know to do your job in Maya society, and you did it. That was your life. Let's talk about warfare in more depth now, because this was such a central part of Maya life, and it was brutal in ways that are hard for us to comprehend. Maya warfare wasn't like modern warfare with its guns and bombs and missiles that kill at a distance. Maya warfare was up close and personal. When Maya warriors fought, they were close enough to see their enemy's face, close enough to smell their fear, close enough to feel the impact when their obsidian blade cut into flesh. Before a battle, there would be elaborate preparations and rituals. Warriors would fast, abstaining from food and sex for days before combat. They'd paint their bodies and faces with war paint, transforming themselves into something more than human, something fearsome. They'd put on their potted cotton armor, their wooden helmets, their elaborate costumes with feathers and hides. They'd gather their weapons, sharpening obsidian blades, checking bowstrings, preparing darts for their atlatls. Priests would perform ceremonies, making offerings to the gods, asking for victory, predicting the outcome based on various omens and signs. The king or war leader would address the warriors, reminding them of their duty, of the glory that awaited them if they fought well, of the shame that would come if they showed cowardice. And then they'd march out, possibly hundreds of warriors, moving through the jungle in columns, scouts ranging ahead to watch for ambushes, everyone tense and alert. When two forces met, the battle might start with a barrage of projectiles. Archers would loose their arrows, slingers would whirl their slings and release stones, atlatl darts would fly through the air, all of this happening at ranges of maybe 50 to 100 yards. Men would scream and fall, struck by projectiles. An arrow through the chest or throat could kill you in minutes. A sling stone to the head could crack your skull, leaving you bleeding and unconscious, soon to die if the battle moved past you. An atlatl dart, those were basically spears thrown with great force, could punch through cotton armor, could pin a man's arm to his side, could drive deep into the body cavity. Then the forces would close for hand-to-hand combat, obsidian-bladed clubs swinging, trying to strike at heads, at limbs, at any exposed flesh. The sound would be incredible, men shouting war cries, screaming in pain, the thudding impact of wood on wood as clubs struck shields, the sharper sound of obsidian on obsidian as blades clashed and shattered. The smell of blood and sweat and fear, men slipping in blood and mud, scrambling to keep their footing, knowing that falling down in a battle meant probable death as enemies swarmed over you.
The goal, remember, was often to capture rather than kill, especially if you could capture an enemy noble. So warriors would try to disable their opponents, strike them in the legs to bring them down, gang up on an enemy warrior and overwhelm him, tie him up and drag him out of the fight. But people died anyway. Lots of people died. Obsidian is sharp enough to cut off limbs. A good strike with an obsidian-bladed club could take off a hand, an arm, could open up someone's chest or belly. The wounds would be horrific. Men would be left on the battlefield with terrible injuries, bleeding out, their intestines spilling from cut bellies, their faces split open, their limbs severed. Those who didn't die immediately from their wounds might die over the following hours or days from blood loss or infection. And if you were captured, your fate depended on who you were and the specific circumstances. High-status captives might be kept alive for months, sometimes years, held as hostages or as trophies. They'd be displayed during ceremonies, dressed in humiliating costumes, forced to participate in rituals that mocked them and celebrated their defeat. Eventually, they'd be sacrificed, but in the meantime, they'd live in captivity, probably not treated well, probably subjected to periodic humiliations and abuses. Lower status captives might be enslaved immediately, put to work for their captors, or they might be sacrificed quickly. Mass sacrifices happened after major victories. Dozens or even hundreds of captives might be killed in elaborate ceremonies, their bodies displayed, their heads taken as trophies. Skulls of enemies were sometimes placed on skull rocks, rows of skulls mounted on wooden frames in your temples, a public display of military might and a warning to anyone who might think about challenging the city. The psychological impact of warfare must have been enormous. If you were a Maya warrior, you'd seen terrible things. You'd seen friends and family members killed in battle. You'd killed enemies yourself, felt your blade cut into their flesh, watched them fall. You'd participated in or witnessed sacrifices, seen captives tortured and killed, Today, we'd recognize this as causing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but the Maya had no concept of that. Warriors who survived were expected to just carry on, to go back to their normal lives. But how do you go back to normal after experiences like that? How do you sleep at night when you close your eyes and see the faces of the people you've killed? Some warriors probably developed a hardness, an ability to compartmentalize and distance themselves from the violence. Others probably struggled with nightmares, with anxiety, with intrusive memories. And warfare wasn't just the big battles. There were constant smaller-scale conflicts, raids on outlying villages, ambushes of travelers or traders, skirmishes between rival settlements. The Maya world was dangerous, and you never knew when violence might erupt. Farmers working in distant fields had to be wary of raiders. Traders traveling between cities had to watch for bandits. Even in the cities, there could be political violence, coups and assassinations, purges of rival factions. Now let's talk about some of the specific types of buildings and architecture in Maya cities, because understanding what these buildings were used for helps us understand Maya life. We've talked about pyramids and temples, but there were many other types of structures. Ball courts are one important type. These were large rectangular courts with sloping walls, used for playing that ball game we talked about earlier. The courts varied in size, but a typical one might be 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. The walls on the long sides sloped inward, and high up on each wall was a stone ring or marker that teens tried to get the ball through. Playing the ball game was brutal. That rubber ball was solid and heavy, probably weighing around 8 or 9 pounds. Getting hit by it hurt. Players wore protective padding on their hips, elbows, and knees, the parts of the body used to strike the ball, but even with padding, they'd get bruised and battered. The game could last for hours, teams chasing the ball back and forth, trying to get it through the ring or to hit certain markers on the court. It was exhausting, physically demanding, and dangerous. Players could be seriously injured, knocked unconscious, even killed if they took a bout hit from the ball or crashed into the stone walls.
And there was that element of religious ritual and possible sacrifice associated with the game. The ball game wasn't just sport, it was a reenactment of mythological events, a ritual combat between forces of life and death, light and darkness. Depending on the specific circumstances and traditions of a given city, the outcome of the game might determine who would be sacrificed. Imagine the pressure of playing a game where losing might mean death. Palaces were where the nobles and royal families lived. These were elaborate complexes of rooms and courtyards, sometimes covering several acres. The buildings were made of stone, covered in plaster, painted with murals. Inside, there'd be residential areas where the family lived, audience halls where the king met with nobles and heard petitions and made judgments, storage rooms for tribute and trade goods, courtyards where ceremonies were held. Palaces were centers of political power, where decisions were made that affected thousands of people. Living in a palace was certainly more comfortable than living in a commoner's thatched house, but don't imagine modern luxury. There was no air conditioning, no running water, no electricity, obviously. Nobles lived in stone buildings that could be hot and stuffy or damp and moldy depending on the season. They had more space than commoners, more possessions, better food, but they still dealt with insects, with disease, with the heat. And they had the stress of political life, the constant scheming and rivalries, the need to maintain status and power, the threat of being overthrown or assassinated if they made enemies. Sweat baths, called temazcals, were important structures. These were small stone buildings with low roofs, basically saunas. Stones would be heated in a fire, then water would be poured over them to create steam. People would sit in the temazcal, sweating profusely in the hot steam. This was believed to be cleansing, both physically and spiritually. It would open pores, help with respiratory issues, ease sore muscles. Priests would use sweat baths for ritual purification before ceremonies. Warriors might use them after battles. Common people might use them when they were sick or just to feel clean. Market plazas were open areas in city centers where people came to trade. Markets were held on specific days, maybe every 5 days or every 20 days, depending on the city and the calendrical system.
People would come from surrounding villages bringing goods to trade. Farmers would bring surplus corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, whatever they'd grown. Hunters would bring deer meat, turkey, fish. Artisans would bring pottery, textiles, baskets, stone tools. Merchants would bring exotic goods from distant regions, cacao from the lowlands, obsidian from the highlands, jade from Guatemala, shells from the coast. The market would be crowded, noisy, colorful, people bargaining, haggling over prices. Remember, the Maya didn't have coins. They used various goods as currency. Cacao beans were the standard, but quetzal feathers, jade beads, copper axes, strings of shell beads, all of these could be used as money. You might trade 10 cacao beans for a rabbit, or a string of jade beads for a beautiful piece of pottery. Transactions were done through direct exchange or through these forms of commodity money. Markets were also social occasions. People would meet friends and family from other villages. They'd exchange news and gossip. They'd hear about political events, about wars and alliances, about what was happening in distant cities. Markets were how information spread through Maya society in the absence of newspapers or telecommunications. Now let's talk about the role of scribes in more depth, because these people were crucial to Maya civilization. Scribes were the keepers of knowledge, the recorders of history, the maintainers of the written tradition. Learning to be a scribe required years of training. A young person, usually a son of a noble, would be apprenticed to an experienced scribe. He'd learn the hundreds of hieroglyphic signs, learn which signs represented sounds and which represented whole words or concepts, learn how to combine signs to write any word or phrase. He'd practice writing on bark paper or on pottery, making the signs over and over until he could write them perfectly. Scribes also had to know the content of what they were writing. They had to know history, the genealogies of kings, the great events of the past. They had to know mythology, the stories of the gods and heroes. They had to know astronomy and how to make calendrical calculations. They had to know the proper forms for different types of texts, how to write a historical inscription on a monument, how to write an astronomical table in a codex, how to write a tribute list for the king's records. The actual work of being a scribe was painstaking. Writing hieroglyphics required precision and artistic skill. Each sign had to be formed correctly with the right proportions and details. Scribes used brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, and they used inks from various materials. Black ink was made from soot or charcoal mixed with a binder. Red ink was made from iron oxide, basically rust. These inks were mixed with water or plant sop to get the right consistency, and scribes would carefully paint each sign, building up complex texts sign by sign. Let's talk now about the relationship between humans and animals in the Maya world. The Maya lived in an environment rich with animal life, and they interacted with animals in complex ways. Some animals were hunted for food, as we've discussed. Others were captured and kept. The Maya kept parrots and macaws as pets or as sources of feathers. These bright, colorful, loud birds were valued for their plumage, which was used in costumes and headdresses. Keeping parrots required effort. You had to feed them, you had to prevent them from flying away, you had to deal with their noise and their tendency to bite. Jaguars held a special place in Maya culture. The jaguar was the most powerful predator in the Maya world, a creature that could kill humans, that hunted at night, that seemed to move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Maya kings associated themselves with jaguars. They wore jaguar pelts. They took names that included the word for jaguar. They portrayed themselves as jaguar warriors. Capturing a live jaguar was an incredible feat, proving your courage and prowess. Jaguar pelts were valuable, worn by nobles and warriors. Jaguar teeth and claws were made into jewelry and ornaments. But jaguars were also feared. A jaguar attack could kill you. Farmers and travelers who encountered jaguars in the jungle were in serious danger. There are stories recorded after the Spanish conquest of jaguars attacking people, dragging them off into the jungle, eating them. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they speak to the fear that jaguars inspired. Snakes also held important symbolic meaning. The feathered serpent, a serpent with quetzal feathers, was a major deity in Mesoamerican religion, including among the Maya. Snakes represented water, fertility, the underworld. But real snakes were a constant danger. Venomous snakes were common, and a bite from a fer-de-lance or a coral snake could kill you. People had to be constantly watchful, checking where they were stepping, where they were reaching with their hands, aware that a snake could be coiled in the undergrowth or hiding in a tree. The Maya believed that animals and humans could transform into each other, that powerful shamans and sorcerers could take animal form. There were stories of naguales, people who could turn into jaguars or other animals, who would prowl at night in animal form, working magic or causing harm. Whether people actually believed they could physically transform or whether this was metaphorical, a way of talking about spiritual power and transformation, is hard to say. But these beliefs were widespread and deeply held. Monkeys were both food and figures in mythology. Spider monkeys and howler monkeys lived in the jungle canopy, and they could be hunted for meat. But they were also seen as somewhat human-like because of their appearance and their behaviors. In Maya mythology, the hero twins, central figures in the Popol Vuh, had older brothers who were transformed into monkeys as punishment for their arrogance. So monkeys occupied an ambiguous position, neither fully animal nor fully human in the Maya conceptual universe.
Dogs, as mentioned, were both pets and food. The Maya had several breeds of dogs. Some were hairless dogs raised specifically for food. Others were hunting dogs or guard dogs. Dogs that were pets were probably treated with affection, like dogs everywhere. They'd sleep near their owners, they'd follow people around, they'd play with children. But economic necessity meant that some dogs ended up as dinner, especially during hard times when other sources of meat were scarce. Now let's think about sleep and dreams, because these were important in Maya culture. Without artificial light, Maya people slept according to natural cycles. When the sun went down, most activity stopped. You might sit by a fire for a while, talking or working on small tasks that could be done by firelight. But pretty soon you'd go to sleep. And you'd sleep for maybe 10 or 12 hours in the winter when nights are long, waking with the dawn. In summer, nights are shorter, but you'd still probably sleep 9 or 10 hours. Sleep was not always peaceful. We know from skeletal evidence that many Maya people suffered from ailments that would have disrupted sleep. Arthritis would cause pain that made it hard to get comfortable. Dental problems would cause throbbing toothaches that kept you awake. Parasites would cause itching and discomfort. Anxiety about food, about violence, about the future would cause sleepless nights. And the sleeping conditions weren't great. You're on a woven mat on a dirt floor. Depending on the season, it might be too hot or too cool. Insects would bite you. Rats or other small animals might scurry around. Strange sounds from the jungle, the screams of animals, the calls of night birds might wake you. Dreams were taken seriously. The Maya believed that in dreams, your soul could leave your body and travel to the spirit world, could communicate with gods and ancestors. Prophetic dreams, dreams that seemed to predict the future, were especially important. A person who had a significant dream might consult with a priest or shaman to interpret it, to understand what the gods or ancestors were trying to communicate. Some dreams were warnings, some were instructions, some revealed hidden knowledge. Nightmares were feared. A nightmare might mean that you'd been cursed by a sorcerer, or that you'd angered the gods, or that a death omen was hovering over you or your family. People who suffered from recurring nightmares might seek help from a shaman, who would perform rituals to cleanse them of whatever spiritual contamination was causing the bad dreams. Sleep itself was vulnerable time. While you slept, your soul was wandering, and it might not return. There were beliefs about spirits that attacked sleeping people, that sat on their chests and suffocated them, that stole their breath or their vitality. What we might recognize as sleep paralysis or sleep apnea Conditions where you wake up unable to move or where you stop breathing during sleep were interpreted as spiritual attacks, and there was little that could be done beyond ritual protections and prayers. Let's talk about old age now, because if you did survive all the diseases and accidents and violence, if you made it to your 40s or 50s or beyond, old age brought its own challenges. By the time you were in your 40s, you'd probably accumulated a lifetime of injuries and wear and tear on your body. Your joints would ache constantly from arthritis. Your back would hurt from decades of bending and lifting and carrying. Your teeth would be worn down or missing. Your vision would be failing. Your hearing would be diminished. You'd probably have chronic health problems, a persistent cough from years of breathing wood smoke, digestive issues from parasites, pain from old wounds that never fully healed. As you got older and less able to do hard physical labor, you'd become dependent on your children to support you. In a society without social security or pensions, your kids were your retirement plan. If you'd had several children and if they'd survived to adulthood and if they were doing okay, they'd take care of you. You'd live with one of your children's families, you'd help out with lighter tasks like watching grandchildren or helping with food preparation, and they'd feed you and give you a place to sleep. But if you'd been unlucky, if your children had died, or if your relationships with them were bad, or if they were struggling to feed their own families, old age could be a time of real suffering. You might end up begging, depending on the charity of neighbors or relatives. You might go hungry regularly. You might be neglected, left alone most of the time, with no one to help you with basic tasks.
Maya culture generally respected elders, at least in principle. Elders had knowledge and experience. They remembered the old ways, the old stories. They could give advice based on decades of life. In some contexts, elders' opinions were sought and valued. But respect didn't always translate into good treatment, especially when resources were scarce and every mouth to feed was a burden. Death, when it came, might be a relief. You'd probably die at home, surrounded by family if you were lucky. There'd be no hospitals, no palliative care, no morphine to ease your pain. If you were dying from old age, from the accumulated failures of an elderly body, you might linger for days or weeks, gradually getting weaker, eating less, sleeping more, until finally you just didn't wake up. If you were dying from an illness or an injury, it might be quicker but more painful, fever and delirium, or bleeding and shock, or suffocating as your lungs filled with fluid. Your family would mourn you. There'd be funeral rituals, your body would be prepared and buried, offerings would be made. Life would go on without you. The sun would keep rising, the corn would keep growing or not growing if there was drought. The wars would continue, the sacrifices would continue, the world would keep turning. You'd become one of the ancestors, your name remembered for a generation or two if you were lucky, then forgotten. Your life just one small thread in the vast tapestry of Maya history. Now, as we drift toward the end of our journey through the brutal realities of ancient Maya life, let's take a moment to reflect on what all of this means. The Maya built one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. They created art and architecture that still amazes us today. They made breakthroughs in mathematics and astronomy. They developed a sophisticated writing system. They created complex political systems and managed to organize societies of tens of thousands of people. These are real achievements, accomplishments that deserve recognition and respect. But all of this was built on a foundation of human suffering. The pyramids that we admire were built by people who worked until their bodies broke down. The beautiful jade jewelry in museums was created by artisans who spent their lives in repetitive, painful labor. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge was developed by elite scholars, while common people struggled to get enough food to survive. The wars that were memorialized in stone inscriptions cost thousands of lives, left thousands of people wounded and traumatized, destroyed communities. This is the paradox of civilization. Ancient Maya civilization, but really any civilization. Great achievements and great suffering exist side by side.
The same society that could calculate the movements of Venus with incredible precision was also a society that regularly sacrificed children to make it rain. The same society that created beautiful art was also a society where most people spent their lives in grinding poverty and hard labor. You can't separate the achievements from the suffering. They're bound together, two sides of the same coin. For us, looking back from the comfort of the 21st century with all our modern conveniences and our longer life expectancies and our medical care, it's easy to focus only on the achievements, to romanticize the past, to see only the pyramids and the art and the intellectual accomplishments. But if we want to really understand the ancient Maya, if we want to honor their full humanity, we have to also acknowledge the suffering, the brutality, the harsh realities of their daily lives. The ancient Maya were people like us. They loved their families. They hoped for better lives for their children. They celebrated when things went well and grieved when things went badly. They laughed and cried and dreamed and feared. They experienced joy and pain, triumph and defeat. But they lived in a world that was much harder than ours, a world where survival itself was an accomplishment, where every day demanded courage and endurance. And yet they endured, generation after generation, century after century. For more than 3,000 years, Maya people survived and built and created and loved and lived. They adapted to their environment. They developed technologies and strategies that allowed them to thrive in a challenging landscape. They created meaning through their religion and their art and their stories. They found ways to make life bearable, even beautiful, in the midst of hardship. The collapse of classic Maya civilization in the 9th and 10th centuries wasn't the end of the story. The Maya people survived, adapted, rebuilt in new places. Northern cities like Chichen Itza flourished after the southern cities fell. Smaller communities persisted throughout the region. And when the Spanish came, the Maya resisted, fought back, endured another catastrophic period of disease and conquest and colonization, and they survived that too. Today, millions of Maya people live in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They speak Maya languages, 21 different languages descended from the ancient Maya language family. They maintain cultural traditions that go back centuries. They grow corn using techniques that would be recognizable to their ancestors. They tell stories that echo ancient myths. They are the living descendants of the people we've been talking about, carrying forward a cultural legacy that has survived for millennia.
So, when we think about the ancient Maya, when we visit their ruins or see their art in museums or read about their achievements, we should remember the full picture. Yes, marvel at the pyramids, but remember the people who died building them. Yes, admire the jade jewelry, but remember the artisans who spent their lives creating it. Yes, appreciate the intellectual achievements, but remember that most Maya people never learned to read, spent their lives doing hard manual labor, died young. The full story of the ancient Maya is a story of human achievement built on human suffering, of beauty and brutality intertwined, of a people who endured incredible hardships and yet created something remarkable. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can take from studying the ancient Maya. Human beings are capable of enduring extraordinary hardship. We're resilient, adaptable, creative even in the midst of suffering. We find ways to survive, to create meaning, to build something that lasts beyond our individual lives. The ancient Maya faced challenges that would break many of us, and yet they persevered for thousands of years. They created a civilization that still captures our imagination more than 1,000 years after its classic period ended. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, safe and comfortable in ways that ancient Maya people could never have imagined, spare a thought for those long ago people, for the farmers who worked from dawn to dusk, for the women who ground corn until their knees and backs gave out, for the children who died too young, for the warriors who faced death in battle, for the captives who were sacrificed, for all the millions of Maya people who lived and loved and suffered and endured. Their lives were brutal in ways we can barely comprehend, but they were also fully human lives, as valuable and as meaningful as any lives today. They deserve to be remembered, not just for their achievements, but for their full humanity, their struggles as well as their successes. And with that thought, as this long journey through Maya history comes to an end, let yourself relax completely. Let the weight of centuries fade away. You're here, now, safe and comfortable. The harsh realities of the ancient Maya world are long past. The harsh sun, the grinding labor, the constant hunger and fear, all of that is history now. Stories to be remembered but no longer lived. Close your eyes, breathe deeply. Let yourself drift away into peaceful sleep. Grateful for the comforts of the modern world. Grateful that you don't have to face what the ancient Maya faced every single day. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake refreshed, knowing that you've taken a journey through one of history's most fascinating and challenging civilizations. Thank you for joining me here on Dreamless Timelines for this exploration of why life was brutal for the ancient Maya. Until next time, sleep well, and remember to subscribe and leave a comment about what you'd like to explore next. Good night.